on a quiet night in Georgia. In a town so small, everyone knew each other's business. The name Sheriff Marcus Baylor carried a weight that felt almost untouchable. He was the man people trusted to keep order, the one they waved at from their porches, the one who stood at high school football games with a hand on his holster like nothing bad could ever happen on his watch. But all of that changed in the span of a few violent seconds inside his own living room. It started with a call to 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady, asking questions the way they had 100 times before, but the words coming through the line didn't make sense. A frantic neighbor reported gunshots coming from the sheriff's house. Multiple shots, rapid fire. By the time officers arrived, lights flashing across the small, neatly kept yard, the scene inside was something no one in that town could have ever imagined. There was Alana Baylor, the sheriff's wife of just over a year, sprawled out on the floor in front of the couch, her body riddled with bullets. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the beige carpet. And, standing a few feet away, still holding the weapon he had sworn to use only to protect others, was Sheriff Marcus himself. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't even argue. He just stood there, gun in hand, staring at what he'd done, and when another deputy shouted for him to drop the weapon, Marcus obeyed without a word. News traveled fast. By the time the coroner's van carried Alana's body away, whispers were already rippling through town. The sheriff had killed his own wife? Why? What no one knew in that first chaotic hour was that the truth behind the killing wasn't just about a marriage gone wrong. It was about a secret that Marcus claimed had shattered his world in an instant. A secret that would ignite a firestorm across the country. According to Marcus, the argument that night spiraled into something he could no longer ignore. For months, he had wondered why Alana avoided the intimacy most married couples take for granted. For months, he had brushed off excuses about headaches, exhaustion, and not feeling ready. That night, pushed past his breaking point, he demanded answers. And when she finally broke down and admitted the truth, that she was transgender, that she had been born male and had not undergone full surgery, Marcus said something inside him snapped. He pulled his service weapon. He fired, again and again. The brutality of it was shocking. But what made it even more explosive was the reason behind it. Within days, the story went national. Sheriff shoots wife after discovering she was transgender. The headlines splashed across newspapers and TV screens, sparking outrage, sympathy, and a bitter divide. Some saw Marcus as nothing more than a cold-blooded killer who executed a woman for daring to keep part of her past private. Others, disturbingly, claimed they could understand the rage of a man who felt deceived. In court documents released later, the prosecution would describe Marcus's actions as nothing less than murder, premeditated, merciless, and fueled by hatred. The defense would tell a very different story, painting him as a man blindsided by betrayal, humiliated in the most intimate way, pushed into a temporary madness he couldn't control. But in that first week before lawyers and courtroom strategies took center stage, all the public saw was a sheriff in handcuffs, his face pale and hollow, being led from his own home like any other criminal. And all they saw of Alana was a single wedding photo that surfaced online, a smiling woman in a white dress, standing next to the man who would later kill her. It was the kind of story that cracked America in two, raising questions no one seemed ready to answer. What is deception in a marriage? Where does love end and betrayal begin? And could a secret ever justify the kind of violence that left a woman dead on her own living room floor? That night in Georgia wasn't just the death of Alana Baylor. It was the death of the town's faith in its sheriff, the unraveling of a marriage built on fear, and the spark of a national debate that would echo far beyond the small streets where the shots were fired. Before the mugshots, before the handcuffs, before the headlines that turned him into a national villain, Marcus Baylor was a man carved out of the red clay and grit of rural Georgia. He was born in 1977, in the same county where he would one day wear the badge of sheriff. People said Marcus was raised on discipline. His father, a Vietnam veteran turned factory worker, believed in hard work, respect, and God's word. His mother was quiet, church-going, a woman who ironed his Sunday shirts and whispered prayers over him before school. By the time Marcus was a teenager, everyone knew he was headed for law enforcement. He was the boy who kept his hair cropped short, who stood when elders entered the room, who threw himself between bullies and weaker kids on the playground. He joined the football team in high school, not because he loved the game, but because it taught him about hierarchy and control. Teachers described him as serious beyond his years. His classmates called him the lawman long before he ever wore a badge. At 21, he entered the police academy. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he was relentless. He studied every procedure, memorized every regulation, and scored near the top of his class. Back in town, people nodded with approval. That Baylor boy's going to keep this place straight, they said. And for a while, it seemed true. Marcus worked his way up from patrolman to detective, and eventually, after 2 decades of service, the townspeople elected him sheriff. He was only 42 then, young enough to still be energetic, but seasoned enough to carry authority. At community barbecues, you'd see him in uniform, shaking hands, laughing politely, but always keeping one eye on the crowd. He was that kind of man, present, respected, but never completely at ease. Behind the badge, though, Marcus carried the weight of his own loneliness. His first marriage had ended quietly after just a few years, the court papers citing irreconcilable differences. Locals whispered that his wife couldn't handle his rigidity, that living with Marcus was like living under constant cross-examination. After the divorce, Marcus buried himself in work. He lived in a modest brick house just outside town, the kind with an American flag planted in the yard and a pickup truck in the driveway. Neighbors saw him mowing the lawn on Saturdays, alone. But respect doesn't fill the silence of an empty home. And by his mid-40s, Marcus was tired of coming back to 4 walls and a muted television. That's when he met Alana. She was new in town, graceful, warm, quick to laugh. To Marcus, she was a light, an answer to prayers he hadn't dared to voice. Friends remembered how he seemed softer with her, how he smiled more, even teased now and then. For a man who had built his life on discipline and restraint, Alana felt like freedom. Still, Marcus never shook the habits drilled into him since childhood. He cared deeply about appearances, about what the town thought of him. As sheriff, he was constantly under a microscope. Every Sunday, he sat in the same pew at First Baptist, nodding along to the preacher's words about sin and salvation. He spoke at high school assemblies about staying out of trouble. He told young men to do right by your family, do right by your God. He preached values because they were the armor that kept his image spotless. But armor can weigh heavy, and Marcus was a man who lived in fear of cracks showing. He believed respect was fragile, that one rumor could unravel decades of work. That belief would become the fault line running through his marriage to Alana, a fault line that widened with every excuse she made to avoid the intimacy he longed for. To outsiders, the Baylors looked like a happy couple. The sheriff and his beautiful wife, waving together at parades, hosting backyard cookouts. But inside the home, silence grew louder. Marcus asked questions Alana dodged. He offered patience at first, then suspicion, then frustration. For a man whose whole life was built on control, being shut out by his own wife felt like a betrayal he couldn't name, but one he couldn't ignore. In the months before the shooting, colleagues noticed his temper flaring more often. Deputies whispered that he was drinking more at night, showing up to work tired. He snapped at minor mistakes, scolded rookies harshly. To them, it was just stress, the burden of being sheriff in a town that demanded perfection. But looking back, those cracks told a different story. Marcus Baylor was unraveling one thread at a time. And so, when people later asked how the sheriff of a small Georgia town could commit such a shocking act of violence, the answer wasn't simple. To understand Marcus Baylor was to understand a man shaped by strict rules, unyielding faith, and a desperate need to be seen as unblemished. He was a man who had given everything to a community that put him on a pedestal, only to find his private life crumbling beneath the weight of secrets he never expected to face. It was that collision between public image and private reality that would drive Marcus into the darkest act of his life. Alana didn't grow up in that Georgia town. She arrived there like a ghost slipping into a story already in progress, a stranger who seemed to appear out of nowhere. For most folks, that was enough to spark curiosity. In a place where generations lived and died on the same streets, a newcomer always stood out. But Alana had a way of smoothing over questions. She was polite, disarming, and when she smiled, people didn't press her about where she came from. What people didn't know was this: Alana was beautiful. Not the kind of beauty that screamed for attention, but the quiet kind that drew people in. She carried herself with poise, moved with grace, and spoke with a soft southern lilt that sounded borrowed, as if she'd practiced it long enough for it to stick. At 36, she seemed both worldly and fragile, a woman who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. For Marcus, meeting her was like stumbling across an oasis after years of dry land. She was different from the women he had known, more attentive, more tender, and yet, somehow, more guarded. He found her at a church social, of all places, standing off to the side of the dessert table, laughing politely at jokes she didn't seem fully invested in. When he introduced himself, she met his gaze directly, as if she wasn't intimidated by the sheriff's badge or the authority that clung to him. That confidence hooked him instantly. They courted quickly, the way people in small towns often do. Dinners at the one nice restaurant in town, long drives down back roads, quiet evenings on her porch. Marcus thought he'd finally found the kind of companionship he'd been craving. A woman who made him feel alive again, a woman who softened the edges of his rigid world. Neighbors noticed how he lit up around her. The sheriff finally found himself a good woman, one shopkeeper remarked. And Marcus didn't correct them. But behind Alana's gentle demeanor lived a truth she carried like a stone in her chest. She was transgender, a fact she had spent her entire adult life protecting. In cities she had lived before, she knew what it meant to be found out. Whispers turning into slurs, jobs lost, apartments suddenly unavailable. Moving to a small Georgia town, she promised herself she would live quietly, carefully, and above all, safely. Loving Marcus complicated that promise. Still, for a time, she let herself believe she could have both, a husband and her secret. She told herself the lack of intimacy would be temporary, that she'd find the right words eventually. But every time Marcus's hand lingered too long, every time his questions brushed too close to the truth, fear tightened its grip on her. What if telling him destroyed everything? What if it cost her not just her marriage, but her life? Alana built her defenses out of excuses. Migraines, exhaustion, a vague medical condition she didn't want to discuss. And for months, Marcus accepted them, though each excuse chipped away at his patience. To Alana, the marriage was a fragile balancing act. To Marcus, it became a puzzle he couldn't solve. Friends who had spoken briefly with Alana described her as kind but distant, warm in conversation but never too revealing. She never shared much about her family, other than saying she'd lost touch. She worked part-time at a small boutique in town, folding clothes and chatting with customers, but never built close friendships. It was as if she was always performing, always managing how people saw her, careful not to let anyone get close enough to glimpse the truth beneath. Yet in the private moments with Marcus, there were flashes of vulnerability. Nights on the porch when she'd lean against his shoulder and whisper how grateful she was for him. Letters she left in his jacket pocket with little notes. You make me feel safe or you give me hope. Those were the pieces of herself she could offer without risk. And to Marcus, those crumbs felt like devotion. But secrets have a way of leaking through cracks. Marcus's suspicions grew sharper with time. He'd ask more pointed questions. He'd press harder about why she kept pulling away. And though Alana tried to soothe him, her evasions only fueled his doubts. In truth, Alana lived with constant dread. Every morning she dressed carefully, every word weighed before it left her mouth. She knew that being found out in the wrong way could strip away everything she had built. She had seen it happen to others, trans women beaten, shunned, erased. So she clung to the illusion of normalcy, hoping it would hold. What Alana never realized was how much pressure that illusion put on Marcus. He saw her silence as distance, her secrecy as betrayal. And in a man raised to see the world in absolutes, truth versus lies, right versus wrong, Alana's hidden past became the crack that would eventually split their marriage wide open. By the summer of 2023, the tension between them had reached a boiling point. Friends noticed Marcus seemed restless, easily agitated. Alana looked more withdrawn, her smiles tighter, her eyes heavier. It was as if both of them knew the truth was standing at the edge of their marriage, waiting to be dragged into the light. In another world, Alana might have had the chance to share her story on her own terms, to be met with understanding, even forgiveness. But in that small Georgia town, married to a sheriff whose entire identity was built on control and reputation, her secret was a ticking clock. And the night it ran out would cost her everything. By the time fall rolled around, the cracks in the Baylor marriage were impossible to ignore. To the town, they still looked like the perfect couple. Sheriff Marcus with his commanding presence, Alana, with her graceful smile at church services or the grocery store. But inside the walls of their modest brick home, silence had become their constant companion. Conversations grew shorter. Arguments flared over the smallest things. What to eat for dinner, why Alana didn't want to attend certain community events, why she always seemed tired. Marcus's patience had worn thin. At first, he convinced himself that Alana just needed time. Maybe she had past trauma. Maybe she was shy. He told himself that love required understanding, that he could be gentle. But as months slipped by, that gentleness hardened into suspicion. A man like Marcus, who lived his entire life demanding answers from criminals and suspects, wasn't built to tolerate mystery in his own home. And Alana, no matter how she tried, couldn't offer him the clarity he wanted. The lack of intimacy gnawed at him most. Friends noticed how he joked, half serious, about needing a cold shower every night. Deputies heard his frustration slip into conversations, even when he tried to laugh it off. For a man who prided himself on control, the absence of physical closeness in his marriage felt like failure, like rejection. And every time Alana pulled away from his touch, he felt less like a husband and more like a stranger sleeping under the same roof. Alana, on the other hand, was living in a state of constant fear. Each excuse she gave, headaches, exhaustion, a vague doctor's appointment she never explained, felt thinner than the last. She saw the suspicion building in his eyes, the way his voice tightened when he asked questions she couldn't answer. She knew the truth would eventually come out. The only question was how. The fights became sharper. Marcus began keeping track, mentally cataloging every excuse, every inconsistency. He started asking more pointed questions, sometimes late at night, his voice low and steady in the dark. "What are you hiding from me, Alana? Why aren't you telling me?" She would roll away, whisper something about being tired, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Then came the moments that hinted at something darker inside Marcus. Deputies noticed him snapping more often at the station. One rookie filed a quiet complaint about how the sheriff blew up over a minor paperwork error. At the local diner, Marcus lost his temper with a waitress when his order was wrong, slamming his fist on the counter hard enough to rattle the silverware. Folks chalked it up to stress, but those closest to him knew it was more than that. He was unraveling. Rumors even started circulating in town. Some wondered if Marcus's marriage was unconsummated, a word that sounded archaic but carried sting in a place where people prided themselves on family values. One neighbor mentioned overhearing muffled arguments through open windows on humid nights. Another swore she saw Alana crying in her car outside the boutique where she worked. Whispers spread quickly, though no one dared confront Marcus directly. The more isolated Marcus felt, the more his mind turned against him. Late at night, he would stare at the ceiling, imagining scenarios that left him seething. Was Alana cheating? Was she sick? Or was there something worse? Something that made a fool of him without him even realizing it? In his position, reputation was everything. A sheriff who couldn't handle his own household? That was humiliation in a uniform. For Alana, the walls were closing in. She tried to suggest counseling, But Marcus scoffed at the idea. To him, counseling was for weak men who couldn't solve their own problems. He wanted answers, not therapy. She thought about leaving, packing a bag, and disappearing the way she had before. But she cared for him in her own way. She wanted to believe he could love her, even if he never fully understood her. And so she stayed, trapped between hope and fear, praying each day that tomorrow would somehow be different. But tomorrow only brought more pressure. One night, after yet another argument that ended with Marcus storming into the garage, Alana sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. The weight of her secret pressed so hard against her chest she could barely breathe. She knew Marcus was getting closer, circling around the truth like a predator. She also knew that when the moment finally came, it wouldn't end quietly. In the weeks before the shooting, the tension in their house could almost be felt from the outside. Deputies who stopped by to drop off paperwork described Marcus as edgy, restless, like a man carrying a storm in his chest. Alana seemed thinner, her eyes shadowed, her voice softer than ever. The perfect facade of the sheriff's marriage was cracking wide open, though no one could yet see how deep the fracture ran. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. The escalating arguments, the sleepless nights, the growing paranoia. Marcus felt like he was losing control of the one place where control mattered most, his home. And for a man like him, raised to believe that weakness was worse than sin, that loss of control felt like death. Neither of them could have known it yet, but the collision was already set in motion. Every sharp word, every cold silence, every unanswered question was another step toward the night when the truth would come crashing into the open and the violence that would follow. It was a Saturday night in late October, the kind of night when the air in Georgia carried a chill, but the house still held the day's warmth. Inside the Baylor home, the lights glowed soft over the living room. To any outsider passing by, it might have looked like a peaceful domestic evening. But inside, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Marcus had come home agitated from the station. He had snapped at one of his deputies earlier that day and barely spoke a word at dinner. Alana, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, had tried to make small talk, asking about his day, but he brushed her off. When she suggested they watch a movie, his jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her stomach twist. He wasn't in the mood for distractions. He wanted answers. The fight started small, the way it always did. He asked why she had canceled another doctor's appointment. She told him it wasn't important. He pressed, his voice low but sharp. She deflected, retreating into vagueness. To Marcus, those evasions were gasoline on an already burning fire. He had spent months choking on suspicion, months being humiliated in silence. And tonight, he decided he wouldn't accept one more lie. "Tell me the truth, Alana," he demanded, his voice rising as he stepped closer. "What are you hiding from me?" She froze, the blood draining from her face. Her hands trembled as she gripped the back of the couch for balance. She tried to turn the question away, tried to tell him she loved him, that he was imagining things, but Marcus wasn't hearing it anymore. His voice thundered through the house now. Words ricocheting off the walls. "I'm your husband. I have a right to know." The argument escalated into a storm. Marcus accused her of betraying him, of making a fool of him in front of the whole town. Alana pleaded with him to calm down, to sit, to wait until she could explain. But Marcus wasn't listening. His pride, his fear, his festering humiliation all boiled over. He stepped forward, grabbed her by the arm, and shouted, "Show me, right now." Alana's heart pounded so loudly she thought she might faint. For years, she had lived in terror of this exact moment. She had built her life on carefully constructed half-truths, always one step ahead of discovery. Now, under the glare of her husband's rage, there was nowhere left to hide. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Marcus, please, you don't understand." "Then make me understand," he snapped. His grip tightened. His face was red, his chest heaving. In that moment, she realized there was no more delaying, no more pretending. Trembling, she pulled away, her hands fumbling as she unbuttoned her jeans. Her movements were shaky, halting, but deliberate. And then, Just like that, the truth was laid bare. The room seemed to fall into silence. Marcus's eyes went wide, his breath caught in his throat. What he saw wasn't just a body. It was, to him, a revelation that shattered the foundation of his identity. In an instant, he felt humiliated, deceived, and destroyed. The man who had spent his life being in control suddenly felt stripped of it, naked in his own home. He stumbled back a step, his hand flying to his head. "No, no, God, no," he muttered, his voice breaking. Rage coursed through him like fire. His vision tunneled, and every thought collapsed into one overwhelming feeling: betrayal. He had married a lie. He had lived a lie. And worse, he thought the entire town would see him as the fool who didn't know. Alana reached out, her voice cracking. "Marcus, I love you. I was going to tell you, But the words never finished. Marcus's hand went to his holster, almost by instinct. The cold weight of the service weapon felt familiar, grounding, in a moment where his world spun out of control. His chest heaved, tears blurred his vision, but his finger found the trigger, as if on its own. The first shot rang out, deafening inside the small living room. Alana's body jolted as the bullet tore through her. She gasped, eyes wide with shock, and collapsed against the couch. But Marcus wasn't finished. His fury, his humiliation, his panic, all of it poured out through the barrel of his gun. He fired again, and again. Each shot echoed like thunder. Each one a punctuation mark on the collapse of a marriage built on fear and silence. By the time the smoke cleared, Alana lay motionless on the carpet, blood spreading across the beige fibers in a dark, widening stain. Her chest no longer rose. The house, once filled with shouting, was now suffocatingly quiet. Marcus stood over her, the gun still warm in his hand, his ears ringing from the blasts. For a moment, he didn't move. He just stared at the woman who had been his wife, the woman who had shared his bed, now lifeless at his feet. He felt a strange mixture of power and horror, like a man waking from a nightmare only to realize the nightmare was real. The silence was broken by the sound of a neighbor pounding on the door, shouting if everything was all right. Marcus blinked, coming back into himself. He set the gun down on the coffee table, his hands trembling, his heart racing. He knew the world outside those walls would never see him the same again. Minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars washed over the house. Deputies stormed in to find their sheriff standing pale and hollow-eyed beside his wife's body. When ordered to put his hands up, Marcus obeyed without protest. The man who had once symbolized law and order now looked like any other suspect, his reputation obliterated in a single night of violence. And as he was led out the door, cuffs biting into his wrists, the whispers of neighbors began to spread into the darkness. The sheriff shot his own wife. The sheriff shot her dead. What they didn't know yet was why. That truth, the secret Alana had carried, and the revelation that had broken Marcus Baylor, would come crashing into the public eye in the days ahead, igniting a storm far beyond their small Georgia town. The first responding deputies who entered the Baylor home that night would never forget what they saw. Their own sheriff, the man they'd saluted every morning, stood pale and hollow in the living room with his service weapon resting on the table and his wife's body sprawled across the blood-soaked carpet. It was the kind of scene that made time feel distorted, familiar faces caught in a nightmare no one could comprehend. Deputy Carl Jensen, who had worked under Marcus for nearly a decade, was the first to speak. "Sheriff, what happened here?" His voice trembled, not with fear of the crime, but with disbelief that the man he admired could be standing over a body. Marcus's eyes flicked up, red-rimmed and distant. "I shot her," he said flatly. "She lied to me. She wasn't who she said she was." The deputies exchanged glances, unsure how to proceed. Protocol demanded they treat him like any suspect, but the reality of cuffing their own sheriff weighed heavy. Still, procedure won out. They read him his rights, hands shaking, and led him outside. The neighbors gathered in small clusters on the sidewalks, whispering as the flashing lights lit up the quiet street. Seeing Marcus Baylor, the lawman of their town, shoved into the back of a squad car with his head bowed was a sight that rippled through the community like a shockwave. Inside the house, investigators began piecing together the scene. The living room looked like any ordinary suburban space. Family photos on the walls, a half-finished cup of coffee on the table. But the violent disruption was undeniable. 9 bullet casings were scattered across the floor. Blood spattered the couch, the walls, even the television screen. It wasn't a single moment of loss of control. It was rage sustained over multiple pulls of the trigger. The coroner arrived, kneeling beside Alana's body. It didn't take long for the truth about her anatomy to become clear. The report later noted the presence of male genitalia, a fact that would transform a case from a local tragedy into a national scandal. Forensic photographers documented everything, careful to capture the physical evidence that would later play out in court, the trajectory of the bullets, the distance of the shots, the pattern of blood. Each detail painted the picture of an execution more than an accident. Back at the station, Marcus was processed like any other criminal. His badge, his belt, and his gun were stripped away. His mugshot captured a man who looked decades older than his 46 years. Eyes sunken, face blank, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. When detectives sat him in an interrogation room, he didn't deny pulling the trigger. In fact, he repeated it over and over. She lied to me. She wasn't a real woman. I couldn't live with that. His words, captured on tape, would later haunt the courtroom. News of the killing spread within hours. Local papers ran the headline sheriff's wife dead in domestic shooting, but by the next morning, national outlets had picked up the story. Once the detail leaked that Alana was transgender, the coverage exploded. Talk shows, opinion panels, and social media platforms lit up with debates. Some voices condemned Marcus immediately, calling it a hate crime. Others twisted his confession into sympathy, arguing that he was betrayed. The town that had once seen Marcus as a symbol of law and order now found itself at the center of a cultural war it never asked for. Detective Olivia Harris, brought in from the county's major crimes unit to avoid conflict of interest, took charge of the investigation. She was methodical, sifting through both the crime scene and the Baylor's history. She interviewed neighbors who admitted hearing arguments in recent weeks, though none had expected violence. She spoke to Alana's co-workers at the boutique, who described her as kind but guarded, someone who seemed to live with an invisible weight on her shoulders. The autopsy confirmed what the investigators already knew. Alana had been shot multiple times at close range, the fatal wounds in her chest and abdomen. Toxicology came back clean. She hadn't been drinking or using drugs. There were no signs she had attacked Marcus. This was not self-defense. It was deliberate. Prosecutors began building their case almost immediately. District Attorney Frank Miller held a press conference on the courthouse steps, his voice firm. No one, not even a sheriff, is above the law. This was an act of cold-blooded violence, and we will pursue justice to the fullest extent. Behind him, protesters gathered, some holding signs that read justice for Alana, others carrying placards claiming Marcus was the victim of deception. The divide in public opinion was sharp, and it grew sharper by the day. Meanwhile, Marcus's defense team floated their own narrative. They argued he had suffered a psychological break after learning the truth about his wife. They used terms like heat of passion and temporary insanity, trying to frame his actions not as premeditated murder, but as a man pushed past his limits. Privately, though, even his attorneys knew the uphill battle they faced. 9 shots, a sheriff trained to de-escalate, a weapon drawn not in self-defense, but in rage. Inside the town, people who had once waved at Marcus on the street now avoided his name. Mothers pulled their children closer when they passed his old house. Deputies at the station worked under a cloud of shame, their leader now branded as a killer. The church pew where Marcus and Alana once sat together remained empty, a silent reminder of the scandal that had cracked the town wide open. What made the case so explosive wasn't just that a sheriff had killed his wife. It was the layers of betrayal, identity, and prejudice tangled up in the act. To some, Alana was a victim twice over, first of a society that forced her to hide, and then of the man who couldn't accept her truth. To others, Marcus was a man undone by deception, blinded by humiliation. And to investigators, it was simpler than that. A husband emptied his service weapon into his unarmed wife, and no justification could erase the brutality of it. As the investigation wrapped and the trial date loomed, one thing was clear. This case wasn't just about a crime in a small Georgia town. It was about the collision of secrets, pride, and prejudice, and the devastating cost when all three meet at once. The trial of Sheriff Marcus Baylor was unlike anything the sleepy Georgia county had ever seen. By the time jury selection began, satellite trucks from CNN, Fox News, and every major outlet lined the courthouse square. Reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps, microphones raised, narrating every arrival as if it were the Oscars. Protesters gathered daily, some holding rainbow flags and signs that read justice for Alana, others clutching placards declaring he was deceived. The air around the courthouse was thick with tension, not just about guilt or innocence, but about what this case meant. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Jurors sat stiffly, chosen after days of grueling questioning. The defense had fought to weed out anyone openly affiliated with LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, while the prosecution worked to exclude anyone who had donated to Marcus's last election campaign. By the time the final 12 were seated, it was clear the panel reflected the same divide splitting the nation. Some skeptical of Marcus, others wary of Alana's secret. The prosecution opened first. District Attorney Frank Miller wasted no time. He stood before the jury, his voice steady but hard, and laid out the facts. 9 bullets, all fired from Marcus's service weapon. At close range, he showed crime scene photos, images of blood pooled into the carpet, shell casings scattered like breadcrumbs across the floor. The jurors flinched. Miller's point was sharp. This was not a momentary lapse, not a single shot in panic. This was rage, sustained and deliberate. Sheriff Baylor was trained to de-escalate, Miller said, pacing before the jury box. He was trained to protect. Instead, he chose to execute his wife because he discovered something about her that bruised his pride. This was not justice. This was not self-defense. This was murder. When the defense rose, their strategy was clear. Reframe Marcus not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man shattered by betrayal. Led attorney Robert Givens, a seasoned criminal lawyer from Atlanta, spoke in measured tones. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is a man who lived his life in service to the law, a man who was blindsided by a secret so profound it destabilized his entire world. What happened that night was not calculated. It was not premeditated. It was the tragic result of psychological break, of a man pushed beyond human endurance. The defense leaned heavily on the idea of heat of passion. They painted a picture of Marcus as a victim of deception, a husband who believed he had been tricked into a marriage built on lies. They brought in a psychologist who testified that Marcus's discovery could have triggered an acute dissociative state, impairing his judgment in the moment. The courtroom was a battleground of narratives. Witnesses took the stand one after another. Neighbors recounted hearing arguments late at night, voices raised and doors slamming. One boutique co-worker testified that Alana had confided in her once, whispering through tears that she was terrified Marcus would never forgive me if he knew. The medical examiner walked the jury through the autopsy report, describing the wounds clinically but with grim precision. There were 9 shots fired, he said. Any one of 3 to the chest could have been fatal. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the playing of Marcus's taped interrogation. The jury watched his face on the screen as his flat voice filled the courtroom. She lied to me. She wasn't a real woman. I couldn't live with that. The words hung in the air like smoke. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions unreadable. Alana's past also became a flashpoint. The defense tried to argue that her secrecy was central to the case, even attempting to introduce details about her medical history and transition process. The prosecution objected fiercely, calling it victim blaming. Judge Hernandez, stern and composed, allowed some testimony but warned the defense not to turn the trial into an attack on the victim's identity. Still, the arguments fueled headlines and talk show debates. Was this trial about murder or about deception. Public opinion fractured further as testimony continued. Outside the courthouse, one group of protesters chanted Alana's name, while across the street another shouted support for Marcus, insisting men deserved to know the truth. The case had transcended the courtroom. It had become a referendum on gender, marriage, and violence in America. Marcus himself eventually took the stand, against the advice of some on his legal team. Dressed in a plain gray suit, looking thinner than he had in years, he spoke in a low, steady voice. He described meeting Alana, falling in love, and the growing frustration of their distant marriage. Then he recounted the moment of discovery, how his world collapsed in seconds. "I felt like my whole life was a joke," he told the jury, tears streaming down his face. "I had been lied to about the most important thing a man can know. I wasn't thinking straight. I wasn't myself." His attorneys hoped his display of vulnerability would sway at least some jurors. But on cross-examination, the prosecution hammered him. "Sheriff Baylor, you were trained to remain calm in crises, weren't you?" "Yes." "You were trained to control your weapon, correct?" "Yes." "And yet you fired not once, not twice, but 9 times into your unarmed wife. Was that control, Sheriff? Or was that execution?" Marcus's silence in that moment, his eyes downcast, spoke louder than his words ever could. As closing arguments approached, the divide in the courtroom mirrored the divide outside. The prosecution demanded accountability, framing the case as a hate crime fueled by pride and prejudice. The defense pleaded for understanding, insisting Marcus was a good man undone by extraordinary circumstances. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the nation held its breath. Commentators speculated endlessly. Would they see Marcus as a murderer or as a man pushed past reason? Would Alana's identity overshadow the violence of her death? The jurors deliberated for nearly 2 full days, their silence broken only by brief notes sent to the judge requesting clarifications. Outside, the crowds grew restless, chanting, praying, arguing. And when the jury finally returned, the room fell into a silence so deep it seemed even the cameras stopped humming. Every eye in America was fixed on that courtroom, waiting to hear how 12 ordinary citizens would weigh one extraordinary crime. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, every person present seemed to stop breathing. The foreman, a middle-aged schoolteacher with trembling hands, stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Not manslaughter, not a temporary insanity acquittal. Murder. The words landed like a thunderclap. In that instant, Marcus Baylor, once the most powerful man in his county, was no longer Sheriff Baylor. He was inmate number 40219. Alana's family, who had sat silently through the trial, wept openly. Her sister clutched a framed photo of Alana in her wedding dress, whispering she deserved better. Across the aisle, Marcus's elderly parents stared blankly, as though they couldn't reconcile the boy they had raised with the man the jury had condemned. Outside the courthouse, 2 crowds erupted at once, one cheering, waving rainbow flags in triumph, the other shouting in anger that justice had gone too far. The verdict didn't heal the divide, it widened it. Judge Hernandez delivered the sentence a week later. 35 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least 28. His words were pointed. "You were trusted to uphold the law, Sheriff Baylor. Instead, you violated the most sacred trust of all, the one between husband and wife. The law does not excuse your rage, your prejudice, or your violence." Marcus showed little reaction, only bowing his head as deputies escorted him away. In the weeks that followed, his fall from grace was complete. His badge was stripped from him, his name removed from plaques in the sheriff's office. Campaign signs bearing his smiling face, once stored proudly in garages across the county, were tossed in the trash. Deputies who had once looked to him for leadership avoided saying his name. To them, Marcus wasn't just a criminal. He was a betrayal of everything they had sworn to protect. Prison was no easier. Inmates who recognized him as the man who had locked them away greeted him not with respect, but with jeers. Correctional officers, some of whom had worked with him during his career, now treated him like any other convict. Gone were the crisp uniforms, the polished boots, the nods of deference. Marcus shuffled through prison corridors in an orange jumpsuit, his power reduced to nothing more than a number on a roster. For Alana, death turned her into something larger than life. Vigils sprang up not only in Georgia, but across the country. Her story became a rallying cry for LGBTQ+ advocates, who held her name alongside others lost to violence. Hashtags trended, murals were painted. At pride marches in Atlanta and beyond, signs appeared with her face and the words "her truth cost her life." To many, Alana represented the danger trans women still faced in America. The danger of secrets colliding with prejudice, of love crushed under the weight of fear. The town itself would never be the same. Some residents felt shame that their sheriff had turned into a killer. Others muttered bitterly about deception, convinced Marcus had been provoked. Families divided at dinner tables. Church sermons wrestled with the story, some pastors condemning the violence, others sidestepping it by preaching about the sin of deception. What should have been a private tragedy had become a public fracture, laying bare the prejudices and fears simmering beneath the surface. Nationally, the case sparked debates on talk shows and op-ed pages. Was Marcus a murderer plain and simple, or a man undone by humiliation? Should Alana's decision to keep her secret be viewed as self-preservation or dishonesty? The arguments raged on long after the gavel fell. But the law had spoken. A husband executed his wife, and there would be no walking free. In the end, 2 lives were destroyed. Marcus sat behind bars, stripped of dignity, his legacy reduced to a headline. Alana lay in the ground, remembered not for the life she built, but for the way it ended. Their marriage, once a picture of small-town respectability, had unraveled into a cautionary tale told across the country. And yet, Alana's name endured. In the courthouse square of that Georgia town, someone tied a bouquet of white lilies to the steps where the verdict was read. A handwritten note tucked between the flowers carried words that seemed to capture what so many felt. She only wanted to be loved. Instead, she became a lesson. May we finally learn it. In the months after the verdict, the name Baylor stopped being synonymous with law and order and became shorthand for tragedy. The story didn't fade the way most small-town scandals do. It lingered, replayed on news specials, debated on talk shows, dissected in classrooms. Alana's face, once just a smile in a wedding photo, became a symbol. To her friends, she was still the soft-spoken woman who worked the boutique counter, the one who left little notes of kindness in jacket pockets. But to the wider world, she became part of a larger narrative. Another transgender woman whose life was cut short by violence. Another cautionary tale of what secrecy and fear can breed in the wrong environment. Civil rights groups seized on her story. At vigils across the country, her name was spoken alongside others who had died in similar circumstances. Candlelight marches lit up streets from Atlanta to New York, with banners that read justice for Alana and no more secrets, no more violence. For many in the LGBTQ+ community, she wasn't just a victim. She was proof that silence, born out of fear of rejection, could be deadly. Her life and death became a rallying point for conversations about safety, honesty, and the right to exist without terror. For Marcus, his name was etched into infamy. In prison, he lived stripped of everything that had once defined him: his badge, his authority, his image as the upstanding sheriff. Guards who once saluted him now treated him with cold detachment. Inmates saw him as no different from the men he'd once locked away. He went from a man who enforced order to a man reduced to routine, lining up for meals, folding laundry, marking days on a calendar. What haunted him most wasn't the cell, it was the silence. The silence where Alana's voice used to be, the silence that reminded him that no amount of bullets could erase the truth he'd tried to destroy. Back in their Georgia town, the community struggled with its identity. For some, the case cracked open conversations they had long avoided. Parents found themselves answering questions from teenagers about gender identity and acceptance. Churches wrestled with sermons that no longer fit neatly into black and white notions of sin and righteousness. Others, though, dug deeper into prejudice, convinced that Alana's secret was proof that deception was intolerable. The divide didn't close, it only sharpened, mirroring the national fault lines the case exposed. Yet out of the chaos, there were glimmers of change. A scholarship fund in Alana's name was created by LGBTQ+ advocates, aimed at helping transgender youth in rural communities find support and education. At Pride events in Atlanta, her name was painted on banners, her story shared as a call for protection and empathy. Teachers in the county quietly introduced lessons about tolerance and diversity, framing them not as politics but as survival. The legacy of this case wasn't just about a marriage torn apart or a sheriff's fall from grace. It was about the fragility of truth in a world where identity can be weaponized. It was about the cost of silence, the danger of shame, and the devastating ripple effects when love is built not on acceptance but on fear. Alana's story became a mirror, forcing people to look at themselves, their prejudices, their assumptions about what marriage, honesty, and dignity really mean. And in that small Georgia town, where the courthouse square once swelled with reporters and protesters, life eventually stumbled back toward normal. The satellite trucks rolled away, the cameras dimmed, and the locals were left with their silence. But some things couldn't be undone. The church pew where Marcus and Alana once sat remained empty. The boutique where she folded clothes closed its doors. The sheriff's office hung a new portrait on the wall, the face of her killer conspicuously absent from the line of men who had once worn the badge. In the end, the Baylor case stood as both a warning and a lesson. Secrets can destroy, pride can kill, and prejudice, when left unchecked, can turn a home into a crime scene and a love story into a headline. For those who lit candles in Alana's name, the hope was that her death wouldn't just be remembered as another act of violence, but as a turning point, one that challenged people to confront their fears, to widen their understanding, and to recognize that the cost of denial is always higher than the cost of truth. Her story closed with a photo that still circulates online, Alana in her wedding dress, standing beside the sheriff who would one day pull the trigger. In that image, she is smiling, radiant, full of hope. And perhaps that is the truest legacy she left behind. Not the way she died, but the reminder that every person deserves to live and love without fear, and that the moment we deny that truth, we step closer to tragedy.